Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Hello and welcome to Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson. I'm going to be talking about long-distance relationships in this podcast. From time to time, I touch on this subject, but I was asked recently about this, and so I thought I'd add a little more to this. Now, when I'm talking long-distance relationships, it could be any measure of distance that you consider long. Some people think long distance is coast to coast. Or it can be you in this country and your object of desire in another country. It could be different towns. It's really based on what you consider long distance. And kind of what's the underlying thing here is you're not available to be seen, say, like every day, physically in their presence. Nowadays with technology, you can Skype, you can, face chat, all these kinds of things with the technology. But it's really about physically being present. And when the person isn't available, and usually it's going to be, just to think of it in these terms, you're probably not going to be available for, a period of time. Say if you're on one coast and your love interest is on the other coast, you could be apart for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. And because of the distance to have to travel, it's just not practical for you to be in each other's space every day. So what happens in these kinds of relationships? How do you keep the love going? How do you keep the interest, the spark there? What are some of the pitfalls? What tends to happen in these relationships when you have problems? How do you solve that? Well, I'm just going to take that one from the very beginning. Problem solving in any relationship really has a key element, and it's being willing to listen. And hopefully you have some problem solving skills, because if you don't, a relationship like this is really going to test your security with the other person. Because if you're an insecure individual, then a long distance relationship probably isn't for you. Because long distance relationships, there's only so much reinforcement a person can do and it not get stale. But you have to have a relationship with a person who you can trust, who you feel some sense of connection with. And so it's not for the faint of heart. Now, you can have friendships that are long distance, and they'll last forever. That's what people who are in high school and then their friends grow up and live in different parts of the country. You can write letters or send emails, text messages, and friendships really are based on the kinds of things that you have in common. And you can say no, you can take it or leave it, but you don't have a whole lot of interdependence on each other. But when you go the relationship route, and I'm talking like any relationship, there's more interdependence upon each other. We're talking emotional support. There may be even, a relationship where you blend finances and things like that. So you have more at stake. Maybe you have kids together, and other sorts of responsibilities. See, that kind of relationship, there's a lot of interdependence that goes on. So you need, so you need a foundation of something that's really, really solid in order to make that happen. Emotionally, these are huge. See, this is a lot different. See, friendships, the emotion thing, your friends can agree with you or not agree with you. And if they don't, it's not going to be a big rift in your household. But when you have the relationship, like say like a marriage, just for example, and there's a disagreement there, well, you got to find a way to navigate those disagreements. Because if you don't, then these things tend to grow and grow and grow and grow and become something that has a breakdown in the relationship. And then we're off to the counselor to see what we can do to repair this. But that's life in general. But going back to the long distance relationship and some of the pitfalls, and I was talking about how if you're insecure, why these things don't work. Because insecure people tend to need a lot of validation. And if it's one thing to be validated and saying, you're very pretty. But if the validation has to be, well, do you still love me? You live so far away. Well, how come you don't just move here and stay here? Well, that conversation can go in a circle because you have the relationship, you have the connection, whatever it is, and you live where you live because you have to. I mean, I would imagine that if you could be together, then you would. So there's a practical sense to this, and understand what are your limits? What can you live with? If you can handle not seeing your partner every day, your love interest, then maybe a long distance relationship will work. But if either one of you can't stand the distance or the time apart or not being able to have that physical touch from your partner, then it's not a relationship that's going to be good for you. Because again, the people who are most insecure, and regardless of whether it's not going to be just a relationship, there are going to be other clues in terms of insecurity. But it certainly shows up in something like this, because you can't just necessarily hop on a plane or jump in a car and bridge the distance to make them feel better, only to turn around and walk back out the door and have to go back to where you were. It's just not practical. So again, long distance relationships, they have their challenges. But one of the things that people I've known that have had long distance relationships is they've built in their system, their way of being, times when they know that they're going to get together. They plan that ahead. They plan spending holidays together, or a particular weekend or a particular week. So you have something to look forward to, and that's reassuring. That shows that there is thought put into this, and one of the things that a relationship like this may force you to do is to think about and plan ahead. So if you're a person that doesn't do a lot of planning, well, if you want to be in a long distance relationship, you're going to have to build in to your time those kinds of things so that you can keep the connection alive, keep it going. And with that, the anticipation of seeing your love interest certainly should interest you, and you're not just doing it to appease your partner. You should want to actually spend that time with them. But that's something you have to learn to do. So if you're not a planner, you're going to need to be able to work on that part of yourself. Because if you don't, what's going to appear to be happening is it's going to appear that there's neglect going on. And neglect and people feeling unappreciated is one of the early indicators of a relationship that is not that important. And I've heard it said this way: either you're an option or a priority. And when you're in a long distance relationship, you have to feel like a priority, because if you feel like an option, then somebody's going to start to feel hurt and they're going to want to pull away. And I think we've all had that experience of feeling neglected. And when you start to feel hurt, what do? The feeling rejected really makes you have second thoughts about who you want to be around. One cardinal rule that I would say about anybody in any relationship, and this type of relationship, it really comes to the forefront. How does a person feel when they are with you? Do they feel special? It's not how you feel when you're around them. Obviously, you feel good about them, but how do they feel around you? If that person feels special, feels loved, feels cared about, then that person is somebody who is going to want to have you in their life. Now, to what capacity? That's something you guys get to work on. I'm going to take a break here. I'm going to come right back, and we'll talk more about long-distance relationships.
The GSMC Sex Podcast is a show that examines all aspects of sexuality, from physical to emotional to spiritual. Join our hosts as they discuss age-old questions, common misconceptions, and the latest topics surrounding sex. They'll tackle topics about sexuality from the complicated to the hilarious and everything in between. GSMC Sex Podcast is your show for all of your questions about sex, even some you might not have thought of yet. Download the GSMC Sex Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you can find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Hello, and welcome back to Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. And I'm John Johnson, talking about long-distance relationships. Now, I'm going to drive home another point that I was making, which is to say about how people feel in your presence. That is so critical, because we often get this part really twisted. We think of it in terms of how we feel about them and that they should feel the same way about us. Well, isn't that ironic? Because what we wind up doing when we meet somebody, quite often people don't have a strong feeling for us. So we do a really good job of trying to sell ourselves as to being the person who is worth your time. We do this all kinds of ways. And to the extent that we're on our best behavior, which many of us, we know what that is, to attract someone and trying to keep them in your life, we do this. But what you really have to think about is, and I mean, hang on to this now, it's what's the experience they have when that person is with you? How do they feel about themselves? Because one of the things that I have seen happen many, many times, especially, and you can look at it from this way when people have, let's say you have sort of a so-so first date. And, you know, people aren't really feeling it, because a lot of times what happens in those cases is, say it doesn't go so well, you say something dumb, or you make a remark that reminds them of something else that they don't like, maybe the ex, the person that, and you never hear from again. Well, the reason that happens is because they didn't feel all that great being around you. You want to find out something about the person who you're interested in. Now, this works for the long term, but you want to find out something about the person you're interested in so that you can be the object of their desire. You find out what they want. Now, in the meantime, you're going to be looking at too, okay, do these things match up with who you are? So you got to ask good questions. This is like an interview, but you're going to be taking down the facts and you're going to have to act on them. Because remember, these long distance relationships, you only have so much time to be able to make an impact, and you have to make it count, because you're making this count for the time when you're apart. And you may have to struggle with that. And every relationship has its ups and downs. And it's not just because it's a long distance relationship, at least in understand it from that standpoint. Obviously, there are going to be challenges in a long distance relationship, and that's why we're talking about this. But understand that to be that this is a regular relationship, but we have the added component that there's distance. And we're talking about navigating that part of it. But remember, it's about good communication. Remember, I've talked about planning time together. And I know that for a lot of people, they like to do things just on the spur of the moment. Long distance relationships don't really have a lot of that, if because of proximity. Now, if you live in one town and maybe the towns are, long distance, and I'm going to define something here. I'm not just talking about the fact that you live in the same town. You live in one community that has one name, and then your love interest lives, say, 25, 30 minutes away. That's not a long distance relationship. Maybe it is if you're a kid, but when you're a grown person, you can traverse that distance whether it's by car or public transit, whatever. You can get to that person. I'm talking when you're in the distance of dozens and dozens of miles, hundreds of miles, maybe thousands of miles. That's a long distance relationship. And you have to think of it in terms of that. And how much effort do you want to put into something of that nature? If you're not really committed to working on that, then it's just going to be fun. You're probably a friends with potential, or maybe a friends with benefits kind of thing, if provided that there is a sexual component to it. I mean, think about it. And what I can tell you is, like I said, friends, people that have known each other for years, have kept up a correspondence for years. Friends do the long distance thing great because the romantic part isn't really instrumental here. But, romance can grow from friendships because a lot of people put in their, the way they experience life, that they really want to have somebody that they can be a friend with. And that's to have a relationship outside of just simple amorous feelings that happen. Because once you feel that you are locked in with this person, when you're not feeling like a lover, then you don't want to have to put on, the fake shoes to make that part happen. You want to be able to be yourself. And friends have that freedom to be themselves. And that's the other part. So when you have a love relationship that has a pretty good friendship component to it, and that's why people like that, because I can just be myself. Now, you don't get to be somebody obnoxious, but just like friends would, they tell you about yourself. There's that openness and honesty. Love relationships, and I think because of the vulnerability, sometimes people tend to feel a little more vulnerable in the love relationship to getting their feelings hurt when their lover tells them, look, you're being a slob right now. Whereas your friends tell you, just sort of laugh it off and, clean it up, or you can't hang out with us sort of thing. But again, that's just talking about some of the, the nuanced differences, but it's really, really important to understand this. So if you're going to be in a long distance relationship, or you're thinking about it, or you have somebody of interest, then maybe that person doesn't want to do it because they've never been in it before. Well, these are some of the things to think about. And if you're the person who is trying to get the other individual to buy into a long distance relationship, have them listen to this podcast. And whatever questions and thoughts and ideas that come up, write them down and have a discussion about it. I think that's the best way to bridge some of this. And as it is with any discussion, usually questions and answers lead to more questions and answers. That's a good thing. I mean, we don't have to get buried in trying to solve every problem that happens, because no relationship does that anyway. But it gives you a place to start. And I mean, it is kind of romantic when you think about it. You have the time and the distance apart, and you want to find ways to keep it interesting, to keep it fresh. And whether it's sending notes, creating some rituals. This is another thing to do. Create a ritual of sending a love text or note, every day or every other day, or something that you can establish, something that you can live with, something authentic, because that's something that will happen in a long distance relationship. It will test your authenticity. And by authentic, I mean, are you sincere? Are you honest? Because there are a lot of things we don't know about ourselves and we discover over time. And having the kind of connection where this person is available to you and you can talk. And that's something of a lost art, talking on the phone. And I mean that from the standpoint of, usually when you are in the presence of somebody you're that attracted to, sometimes you have great conversations. And that chemistry of that conversation leading to the closeness, then we tend to want to go for the intimacy, whether it's kissing, hugging, whether it's sex, we tend to do that. But when you're on the phone, so you really can't quite do that. So you have to have that conversation going. And you share a great deal about yourself in those moments. I'm going to take another break, and I will come back and talk about the sharing. Stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
And we're back. This is the Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. I'm John Johnson, talking about long-distance relationships. And when I ended the last segment, I talked about sharing. And I'm going to say that's really, really important. The sharing, what are we talking? We're talking about sharing yourself, the story of your life. Being interested in the other person. So there's a give and take thing here. And you both will have an opportunity to share. This is one of the things that you have to learn how to do. And if you've never been really good at this part, and I'm talking to you who they are thinking about a long distance relationship and wondering how you're going to make this thing work, or you've been involved with somebody. And here's a classic. I've seen young people, they've gone out of high school and now they're going to college. So there's a love connection there, and they wonder how are they going to stay connected. Well, it's not just the fact that we say that we want to be involved with each other, but how do you stay interested in someone? And, young people don't necessarily have a lot of resources to be able to travel back and forth. And I think it's exciting when you think about young love. And this applies to older people too, but I'm picking that example because this is the time in your life when some of those bonds that you develop with people are really, really important. It might be a first love. It might be a second love, but it's really important. And you think about how do we stay connected? And just in general, being able to share about your life and talk about it in not just an interesting way. Of course, that's what we want, but talk about the things that matter to you and turn that into questions about the person you're interested in. Ask them about themselves. Where are they today in their head, in their feelings for not only you, but about what's going on in their life? Maybe they're family members. Maybe they're homesick. And talking to you might give them a sense of connection to their past, to the parts of their life that are really comforting. And that's something to capitalize on. And I mean that in a sense of remind yourself of how important these kinds of relationships are, or these kinds of connections are. Because when you're talking the long distance thing, there are going to be periods of boredom for both of you. And what does that do to you? In your experience, what does that do? And communicate that to yourself. Because think about when you get into conversation with your lover or your love interest, you're probably going to wind up messaging that to them. And if you had some time before the distance kicked in, then you probably established a rapport where there's some understanding of that. But if you're going to wind up learning about yourself through this distance and the time thing, then it's going to take a lot of work. because you're going to be learning not only about them, but you're going to be learning about yourself, how you handle the stress of not having that person in your presence, especially when you feel that really strong tug that you want them around. Because that could be very hurtful to be in that place and to not be able to do anything about it. And like I say, really insecure people do not do well with long distance relationships, because needing the validation and the reinforcement, while it's reasonable to have it from time to time, young people will probably have difficulty with that unless they're extremely mature. Because this is a subject that until you've had experience in life and you think about the possibilities, or you know yourself a little bit and you've had experiences in life. I mean, I know how I am when somebody's not around. I can handle the fact that they tell me what they do, how they feel about me, and I'm not easily shaken. But if you don't have that kind of confidence in the other person that you're trying to be involved with, then this is just going to bring up all of the anxiety about not having that person available to you. Think about it. Relationships, like I said, have always been about work. You learn about yourself. You learn about the other person. You set boundaries. And, the long distance relationship, and now this may not be the cause of it, but you may find out that maybe you're not really that into the person. Now, some people will blame the distance for that happening. I don't necessarily think that that's the cause. I think you find out that there are differences that wouldn't be bridged even if you were in the same town. But the fact that you have distance, it kind of puts you in that place where you can be reflective. You can think about what you value and what this other person brings to your life, and vice versa. What I've been talking about here throws the covers back off of what it takes to be in love with somebody and deal with the long distance thing. Because it's not for the weak-minded or people that aren't up for a challenge. Because there are things that you never predicted, never contemplated, didn't think you had the capacity to deal with, or maybe even things that you said you never would deal with, wouldn't put up with. But when you have that connection with someone, then you're willing to expand your boundaries. Love will make you do things you didn't know you had the capacity to do. That's one of the beautiful things about love. But don't forget, it asks a lot of you as well. So it's about staying connected, your values, your personal and your relationship values. It's not something that's going to be dimensionally close in terms of proximity, because that's why it's long distance. And it doesn't tend to work for clingy types. If you're mature, learn how to plan things, plan ahead so that you can spend time with your person of interest, then there's always a possibility that something like this could really work out for you. And with the idea, and this is something that happens in these kinds of relationships, oftentimes it's the distance is temporary, and that works. But let's say it's an ongoing long distance relationship. Now, it might be, you might have the lifestyle in which maybe you date lots of people, and the long distance relationship doesn't really crimp your style because, well, they're not close, and you have that understanding that you can date other people. So, it fits. At least it'll fit that, the different lifestyle types. People that don't necessarily want close relationships in terms of, that person being underneath them. Some people are really turned off by that and probably gravitate towards the long distance relationships just because it's easier for them emotionally. That, relationships require maintenance. All relationships do. And the long distance ones, depending, like I say, if the people aren't really clingy, then they don't necessarily need a lot of maintenance. They just need validation from time to time. And, depending upon how busy you are socially, if you're a busy person, and again, this is where the conversation with the other person comes in. You got to decide, okay, are we seeing each other on a sort of like part-time basis, or are we committed lovers? Are we seeing each other because we like each other, but we can see other people too? I mean, it certainly kicks open a lot of conversations about what the expectations are. And I talked about early on, you have to know yourself and what your expectations are for yourself and for this relationship. You might be a kind of person who dates lots of people at the same time so that you can kind of feel out, what kind of person do you really like? The long distance part may be real attractive to you. And if you're a person who's been in relationships and found that you just don't want anything really heavy right now, but having somebody who is an interest to you, and this, you could still be a monogamous person. It doesn't mean that you're polyamorous or cheating or anything like that. It just means that if you are at a place in your life where you want to be able to focus on the things that you're focusing on, not so much heavy in romance, but you want a relationship, then the long distance thing really might work for you. But it's got to work for both of you. I'm John Johnson, talking about long distance relationships. Thank you for listening.